Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with the daily update for July 14th, 2021. I'm sure you all heard the old story about the person who was feeling the heat and jumped out of the frying pan into the fire. That, unfortunately, has been the practice of American foreign policy since the end of World War II, where we continue to go from crisis to crisis because we operate from the same mistaken axioms over and over and over, which enable our policymakers to be manipulated by British geopoliticians to the point that Americans and British politicians think the same when it comes to the officials of intelligence community, the Defense Department, the diplomatic corps, and so on. Geopolitics. The fact that we need to have wars, we need to have enemies, we must have a continued flow of funds going into the military-industrial complex, which in turn shapes the media and the thinking of people, and as a result we go into one war after another, repeating the same mistakes. This is the problem of geopolitics. Now, we've come to a potential end of an era with the U.S. withdrawal of Afghanistan. Of troops from Afghanistan. Now, ironically, some Republicans who are supporters of Donald Trump are attacking Biden for pulling the troops out. Well, that's what Trump was trying to do, but he wasn't able to do it. Instead of being happy that there's been a potential to correct the mistakes of the past, it's being used for partisanship. And it's undignified and, in fact, immoral to do that. The question is, since it's good that we're out, it's not clear what is coming. Instead of being afraid of it, it should give us an opportunity to change the axioms. There's a chance to do that with two conferences coming up. On July 13th and 14th, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization will be meeting in Dushanbe in Tajikistan. And then on the 15th and 16th, there'll be a foreign ministers meeting in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. Involved in this will be China, Russia, Iran, India, Turkey on the foreign minister level. Prime Minister Imran Khan of Pakistan is planning on coming, and President Ghani of Afghanistan will be there. It's also the case that there probably will be a State Department official or two attending these meetings, although on a much lower level. Now, what will be discussed there? Regional security, stability, advancing peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan, and economic cooperation. That's why there's an opportunity now to overcome the legacy of 150 or more years, actually about 180 years, of the so-called Great Game policy, which is the forerunner of British geopolitics, which has caused these crises. The question is, will the U.S. participate in an attempt to influence these countries to join a crusade against Russia and China, which so far appears to be the policy if you follow the speaking of Blinken, the Secretary of State, and others, as well as the Republicans? Or will the U.S. be there to engage in real economic development, cooperation that will benefit the region, and by doing so, improve the circumstances for the United States? What's needed in the discussion? Rail connections, gas pipelines, hydroelectric lines, and telecommunication links to enhance trade and commerce. That's the whole purpose of the diplomatic discussion process. We went into Afghanistan initially as a result of geopolitics. The geopolitics I'm talking about is the decision by Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1977-78 on behalf of the Carter administration to launch aid efforts to mujahideen in Afghanistan in an attempt to lure the Soviet Union into sending troops into Afghanistan to get caught in a quagmire. Brzezinski admitted that was the policy. Before the Soviets came in, the U.S. was arming and training mujahideen. This was called the Arc of Crisis, which was a British policy that was adopted by Brzezinski as American policy with the idea being that you could use Islamic regimes or Islamic populations on the southern flank of the southern arc of the Soviet Union to trigger rebellion and revolt and cause problems for the Soviet Union. And as a result, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda gained footholds there when the U.S. left, when the U.S. stopped funding them after the Soviet Union left, and they became the government, and from there, allegedly, from Afghanistan, 9/11 was launched, which then brought us not only the war in Afghanistan in 2001, but also the whole police state security surveillance system, which is now a growing problem for the United States. So geopolitics, listening to these British beliefs that you can control the world by dividing it into competing empires, that you create enemy images and mobilize the population against those enemies, that's the cause of the problem. Now we have another problem we have to address, which comes from the same place: neoliberal economics, the Federal Reserve and central bank system. There are more and more warnings coming out that this whole system is headed for a collapse. Now, of course, Lyndon LaRouche had been chronicling this since August 15th, 1971, step by step. Every single bubble he warned about. Every single response to a crash, he warned about the move toward more Shaktian policy, more austerity, more power for the bankers, less power for the regulators. Now, the latest warning comes from Jacques de la Rosière, the former managing director of the International Monetary Fund, who said that central banks with their low interest rate policy are bringing on a new, worse financial crash. Of course, he has no solution. He does identify liquidity pumping as a cause, but why is there liquidity pumping? Because they're protecting bankrupt banks, and as a result, they're increasing the volume of debt so that instead of building your way out of a financial crisis with physical economic production, they're increasing the debt loads, which they think require more austerity. This is the whole idea of the Great Reset. Give more power to the central banks so they can control spending. They can have dictatorial control over the global economy, and no sovereign nation state will be allowed to protect its country. So the solution to this, the long-term solution, which was identified by LaRouche in the 1970s and repeatedly from the 70s to his passing in February 2019, first, take power away from the central banks. The Great Reset is nothing but a grab for more power. It must not be allowed to happen. Secondly, the best way to break it up is to use Glass-Steagall regulation, restore the Glass-Steagall financial regulation bill, to break up the universal banks of the City of London and Wall Street. It's these universal banks and financial institutions, which became supposedly too big to fail, that are dictating the policy to the central banks, whose purpose is to protect these succubuses of these giant universal banks, which are bankrupt, which should be put through bankruptcy reorganization. Now, the attempt to save these bankrupt financial institutions is the cause for the cheap credit and massive liquidity pumping, which, as I said, just creates bigger than ever debt bubbles. And it takes any credit away from physical economic production. So the solution to the danger of war is the same as the solution to neoliberal economic policies. Sometimes people write to me and say, well, you talk about all the bad things, but what are the solutions? The solutions are there. Lyndon LaRouche presented them years ago. I talk about them almost every single day. LaRouche's 4 laws, Glass-Steagall regulation, a national credit system, infrastructure investment, and focusing much of that investment on research and development into new technologies. That's how you restore the physical economy of the United States. That's the American system. That's more or less what the Chinese are doing with their economic policy. We're accusing them of competing unfairly in the Belt and Road Initiative. What's unfair about it? The government is making credit available to physical production, companies that are moving earth, that are building things. That's what we used to do, and that's what we should get back to. As for geopolitics, this has to end. And instead, we must seek a community of principle of sovereign nation states which cooperate for mutual benefit. Where they disagree, you have dialogue, not war. But the dialogue can bring us to a situation where we can solve these problems, as we may see coming out of these two meetings in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan in the next couple of days. The practices of the British Empire, of the corrupt cabal that represent Wall Street and the City of London, those must be shut down. And we can use this moment of opportunity of ending the war in Afghanistan as an opportunity to do that. Thanks for joining me, and I'll be back again tomorrow.